Hi, this is Jennifer from Read It Again. Come join me while I read part 1 of Moonsilver from the Unicorn Secret series by Kathleen Duey. Please consider subscribing, and if you enjoyed this book, hit the like button and share this video with all your friends. Hart Avamere was tired. Everyone else had gone home. It would be dark soon. The stiff wheat stubble had scraped her hands bloody. There were long scratches on her bare feet. Hart smiled. Her sack was half full. The harvesters had hurried through the fields this year, missing more grain than usual. Lord Dunraven wouldn't like the gleaners finding so much falling grain, but the people of Ash Grove were happy. They would have more bread this winter. Lord Dunraven didn't need their little bit of gleaned wheat. He owned every wheat field, every barley field, every hillside. He owned the forest on the other side of the Blue River, the bridge that crossed the Blue River, and the road that led to Dairytown, belonging to him, too. Lord Dunraven owned towns and villages. He owned everything. Old Simon cleared his throat and spat. "What's that?" he asked, pointing. Hart faced the sunset. Something was moving at the far end of the field, near the edge of the grove of old oak trees. "A deer?" she replied. "Looks like a cow," Simon said. Hart squinted. "I can't tell." The animal was moving farther into the deep shadows. "Whose cow would be out for wolves to find?" Simon asked. He tied up their wheat sacks with twine. Twine he kept in his pockets. "I'll go see," Hart said. Simon nodded. "Hurry back. No playing." Hart glanced at Simon's angular face and thin gray hair. She wished that he loved her, but she knew he didn't. Simon Pratt was not her father, after all, nor was he an uncle or a grandfather or any kind of family. 5 years before, Simon had found her sleeping in the high grass by the Blue River. He had come upon her that morning the way someone stumbles across a nest of quail eggs. Simon told her all about it. He'd been gathering firewood among the cottonwood trees by the river. She had been wrapped in a beautiful blanket, her hair knotted and tangled. "Can you see what it is?" Simon shouted now. Startling her from her thoughts, Hart whirled around. "Not yet," she shouted over her shoulder. Whatever the animal was, it was deep in the dappled shade now. Walking slowly toward the edge of the woods, Hart tried to recall something, anything from before the morning Simon had awakened her in the tall grass. She couldn't. She never could. Her first memory was this. Her eyes had flown open and her breath had come quicker than a startled rabbit. And Simon had been there leaning over her with his sharp-nosed face, his dark eyes and dark clothes. And that was it. Hart could remember everything back to that instant perfectly. But then her memories just ended. Simon had called her girl for weeks. He had not named her. Ruth Oakes had done that. But he had fed her. She was alive. She knew she should be grateful. But all the other children in Ash Grove knew their parents. They knew their grandparents and their great-grandparents. They didn't trust her. They wouldn't play with her or even talk to her. "What is it?" Simon called. "Why can't you see?" Startled again, Hart stopped, peering into the dusky shade under the oak trees. "It's a horse," she called back, surprised. No one in Ash Grove owned horses except Tin Blackaby. "A mare." "Then it's Blackaby's," Simon called. "Leave it alone." Hart nodded. She felt sorry for the horse. Blackaby was Lord Dunraven's steward. He counted out crops and chicks and sheep and corn. He weighed out the peppers and onions people raised to sell to the Dairytown merchants. He told people how much they had to give to Lord Dunraven and how little they could keep. He was not kind. He worked his men and his horses hard. "Blackaby's men will come," Simon shouted. "They'll think we're trying to steal it." "Wait," Hart pleaded. "This isn't Tin Blackaby's horse." "You're sure?" Simon shouted. "Yes," Hart called back. She could see the mare better now. It was white. She'd never seen a white horse in Tin Blackaby's corrals. Coming close, Hart saw the mare's coat was rough, mud-speckled. She was thin, too, her ribs jutting out. Her tail was full of river burrs. "Easy now," Hart said softly. The mare lifted her head and turned. Hart could see scars on her face. The biggest one crossed her forehead, a curved band of stretched, dark skin. "How did you survive that wound?" Hart whispered. The mare lowered her head and came forward. Hart could smell her grass-sweet breath. The horse brushed Hart's cheek with her warm muzzle. Hart closed her eyes at the gentle touch. "Catch it!" Simon shouted. "Use your belt!" Hart opened her eyes and did as she was told. She untied her rough rope belt. The mare stood quietly, then she lowered her head and let Hart slip the loop over her ears. "Good girl!" Simon shouted. Hart glanced back. He was flapping his arms at her. He looked like a crow. Hart tugged gently at the rope. The mare stepped forward, limping. Hart saw dark, dried blood on her foreleg. "You're hurt," Hart said. The mare touched Hart's cheek once more. Then she lowered her head. Hart held the rope loosely, careful not to walk too fast. "Hurry along!" Simon shouted. Hart pretended not to hear him. This mare needed rest and good forage. She needed care. "Well, well," Simon said, rubbing his hands together. As Hart got closer, she saw his eager expression fade. "It's all scarred up," he growled, "and bone thin. Best to sell it to the knacker before it dies. They pay less for dead." Hart swallowed hard. The knacker killed old animals and boiled the meat for tallow. Candle makers and soap makers bought barrels of the smelly fat. Hart shivered. She's just hurt and starved. Simon puffed out his cheeks. He was thinking it over. Hart held her breath. The mare stood behind her, still as stone. "Bring it along, then," Simon said. The mare nudged Hart gently from behind. They followed Simon out of the field and up the slope to the road. Simon kept glancing back, motioning for Hart to catch up. But the mare's limp was worse now that they were heading up the long hill on River Road. Simon frowned over his shoulder. "Come on now, girl, come on." "I'm trying," Hart answered. "I'm tired, Simon." She didn't want him to notice how lame the mare really was. He'd decide to go by the knackers tonight after all. She could smell the stink of the tallow works as they passed Crosswater Street. "Hurry," Simon kept insisting. "I am," Hart said without changing pace. But, as if she could understand human speech, the mare limped along a little faster. Her clopping hooves scuffed up puffs of late summer dust. It was good they had worked so late, Hart thought. No one else was on the road. Simon glanced back. "You are sure it isn't Blackaby's horse?" "Tin Blackaby owns no white horse," Hart replied. "You're certain?" Simon demanded. "Yes," Hart said clearly. "I like horses. I always stop and—" "Good then," Simon interrupted. "Lord Dunraven would not own or want this wreck of an animal. Nor would any merchant. She's some gypsy's runaway," he smiled. "Luck has smiled upon me." Hart felt her belly tighten. "It has?" Simon looked astonished. "Of course. I can sell this old mare to the knacker now, or maybe later after you feed her up a bit. I can make a bit of silver." Hart felt the mare's breath on the back of her neck. "I want to keep her." "Keep the horse?" Simon slowed, frowning. "We can't feed it. Nobles, rich merchants, and gypsies have horses, not people like us." Hart walked after Simon in silence. The mare struggled to keep the pace he set. They crossed the broad arch of the bluff, then started downward again, passing Dunraven's orchards. There were fallen apples just inside the fence. Hart spotted one that had rolled into the road. The mare ate it whole without slowing, tickling Hart's palm when she took it. I'll get up early to cut grass, Hart said. She'll get sound and strong. Simon turned. She might get fatter. The knacker wants them fat. Hart risked a quick smile. Simon hadn't said no. There was hope, and once the mare was well, Hart would try to find work for them both, hauling or plowing. If the mare brought in money, Simon would keep her. Hart touched the mare's scarred face. Meadowsweet will help your leg, I think. Ruth Oakes will know what to do. The mare lifted her head. They went south along River Road, skirting along the edge of town. By the time they turned onto Crooked Lane, heading toward Simon's shack, the mare's limp was terrible. There were only 2 places on Crooked Lane. Ruth Oakes's old stone house stood near the turnoff, neat and well kept. Simon's shack was 2 miles off at the lane's end, where the land dropped down to the river. Hart tried to keep it neat. Simon did not help. Hart saw Ruth Oakes's lantern as they passed. I should go see about the mare's leg, she said. Simon looked back. In the morning. But the mare, Hart began. In the morning, Simon repeated, and tell that old woman I can't pay. Simon's voice was heavy as stone. They walked on in silence. Finally, Simon cleared his throat. You can put it in the old crow pen if you prop up the broken rails. He coughed, then spat. I'm hungry, and I suppose that means fixing my own supper tonight. Hart didn't answer. She let the mare set her own halting pace. Simon went ahead. There was lantern light shining through the door planks when Hart finally passed the shack, leading the mare toward the old cow pen. Simon was eating supper. Hart's mouth watered at the smell of boiled barley, but she knew she had another hour's work before she could eat. It would take at least that long to make the sagging fence fit to hold a horse, even if the horse was starved and hurt and weary. Hart was used to getting up in the dark. She always struck a spark and made a little fire for Simon's barley water. This morning she started the fire, then tiptoed outside. The moon sailed silently overhead. The river's quiet voice came up the grassy hill. Hart peered into the dusk toward the makeshift corral. The mare was lying down. Her white coat shone in the moonlight. Hart's bare feet made almost no sound in the deep dust of Crooked Lane. She ran uphill, grateful to see the bright speck of Ruth Oakes's lantern shining through her window. Ruth stayed up late. She also rose early. She was Ash Grove's only healer. There was always so much for her to do. Hart hurried up the curving path, the sense of Ruth's herb garden tickling at her nose. Hart could see Ruth through the window and knocked quietly. Yes, Ruth called. Come in. Hart pushed on the door. The light from the lantern made her blink. Child, Ruth said, and why are you at my door so early? Hart explained about the mare. Ruth tipped her head and listened. A scarred forehead? She asked when Hart was finished. Hart sighed. Yes, but that's all healed. It's the wound on her leg that worries me. Let's go see, Ruth said, slinging her worn leather herb bag over her shoulder. She picked up her lantern, then headed for the door. Simon won't pay anything. Ruth looked back, smiling. And when did he ever pay me? Hart shrugged, uneasy. I'll do chores. I'll work and when did you ever not pay me in some way? Ruth asked, starting off, quickly setting into her long, striding walk. Hart ran to catch up. The mare was standing when Ruth ducked through the fence. Oh my, she said quietly. Is it that bad? Hart whispered. Ruth didn't answer. She placed one hand on the mare's withers and spoke to her in a quiet, soothing, sing-song voice. Hold the lantern, she said after a moment. Hart held the light steady and high, wincing when she saw the wound on the mare's leg clearly. It was deeper than she had thought. Fresh water, Ruth said, straightening. We'll wash the road dust out of it, then seal it with meadowsweet salve. Hart ran for the well. The bucket was heavy, but Ruth took it in one hand, and tipped it to pour water slowly over the wound. Twice she stopped to dab at the cut with clean cloths from her bag. The mare stood still, her head high. "Will it heal?" Hart asked, biting at her lip. Ruth nodded. "Yes, another scar, but the lameness is just that it hurts her. The tendons aren't cut." Hart exhaled. "I want to keep her. Simon wants to sell her to the knacker, but—" Ruth straightened and turned abruptly. "You can't let him." Hart nodded. "I know. I love her already. She is the sweetest mare." Hart's words were cut off at the sound of the door banging open. "Girl!" "Her name is Hart Avamere," Ruth called out, "not girl." "Did she tell you I won't pay a penny?" Simon groused. Ruth laughed. "She did. The shock of it nearly killed me, Simon." He growled something and went back inside. "I'd better go cut grass for the mare," Hart said, looking at the horizon. "Sunup is coming and we have another field to glean today." Ruth reached out suddenly and touched Hart's face. "You are a good-hearted child." Hart smiled, wishing, as she had 1,000 times, that Ruth had been the one to find her in the river grass instead of Simon. Owing her life to old Simon was a misery. Owing Ruth Oakes would have been a joy. Ruth stepped back. "Starting tomorrow, walk her just a little. Go a bit farther each day. It'll make her eat and keep her leg from stiffening." "I will," Hart promised. Ruth handed her the pot of salve, twice a day, nice and thick. Hart nodded, glancing at the door. "I had better go cut grass." Ruth patted her arm. "Don't let that old man work you so hard." No one in Ash Grove noticed the white mare. Hart was careful. She cut grass before dawn, hidden by the mists that rose from the Blue River. She walked the mare only at dusk and always led her south, away from town. To the south, the land was too dry and rocky to plow. No one farmed it. No one lived there. People often came to Ruth Oakes's house seeking her help, but no one walked 2 extra miles down to the end of Crooked Lane. Adults had no business with Simon. He shouted and threw rocks at children who came too close, so they almost never did. "Ready?" Hart said to the mare every evening. And every evening the mare tossed her mane and whickered quietly. Ruth had given Hart a soft rope of woven flax. Hart had made it into a knotted halter. The mare didn't like it, Hart could tell, but she allowed it. Day by day the mare's limp faded. The cut closed and was healing well. The heavy bundles of grass Hart brought were working magic. The mare gained weight. Her flesh smoothed over the bony ridges of her ribs, and she stood with her head held high. Hart found apples that had rolled beyond the fences around Lord Dunraven's orchards. All the village children hunted these apples. Hart went before first light. Twice she had to run from boys who wanted to steal the ones she'd found. Both times they had given up before the turnoff onto Crooked Lane. None of them wanted to be seen by Ruth Oakes or to cross old Simon's path. "The horse is looking grand," Simon said one evening. His voice startled Hart into whirling around. "Oh, I didn't hear you coming." Simon nodded. "You were too busy talking to the mare." He shook his head, laughing, then ran one hand through his stubbly gray hair. "We can sell her soon. You've got her fat enough for any knacker." "In another month or 2, you could sell her as a saddle horse," Hart said quickly. Simon stroked his chin with one hand. "Is she still limping?" "A little," Hart fibbed. The mare hadn't limped for more than 2 weeks. "You think she's strong enough to bear a rider?" Simon asked. "Not yet," Hart said, pretending to consider the question. "But soon, I think." "But that scar ruins her looks," Simon said, shaking his head. "What gentleman would want such an ugly saddle mare?" Hart frowned at him. "She isn't ugly." "Lower your voice," Simon scolded. Hart looked at her feet. Making Simon angry was foolish. I'm sorry, she said. Simon puffed out his cheeks. Well then, keep feeding it, he said, jabbing one finger at the mare. If no one else wants it, the knacker will. I thought maybe, Hart began, then stopped. Thought what? Simon asked. Maybe I could find an old plow. We could find work. We? Simon repeated. You mean you and the horse? Hart nodded. Simon laughed, then he spat. Plowmen are men, he scoffed. Hart stood tall. I could plow. Simon laughed. You couldn't. It takes weight and strength. Hart felt the mare tug at her sleeve, nibbling at the ragged cloth. Hart glanced at the sky. The sun was setting. I need to take her out to walk. That where you go every evening after supper? Hart nodded. Ruth Oakes said I should. That old faker, Simon said. Her herbs aren't worth half a penny. He headed back toward the house. Hart waited until she heard the door slam. Then she let out a long sigh. I will think of something, she told the mare, turning back. Maybe we could get a hold of an old cart somehow. Would you pull a cart? The mare shook her mane. Hart smiled. She loved it when the mare seemed to understand her. We could carry messages. They say there's a man in Derrytown who carries letters for the merchants and nobles there. The mare shook her mane again, snorting. Hart frowned. If we can earn a few pennies, Simon will let me keep you. The mare lifted her head and flared her nostrils. Hart pulled the halter down from its peg. The mare lowered her head as Hart slid it over her ears. They passed Ruth Oakes's place and turned south, as always. Out on River Road, the mare kept a good pace. As usual, she walked alongside Hart, not behind her. The road was quiet. The air smelled of clean, fresh sage. The sounds and smells of town did not carry this far. Hart glanced at the mare. She had never seen anyone but Dunraven's men or nobles like Tin Blackaby riding. And then, only from a distance, she wanted to learn how. Abruptly, the mare leapt sideways, wrenching hard on the halter. Hart wasn't expecting it. She lost her grip as the mare sprang into a canter. Hart stood, stunned, as the mare galloped away. Then she lunged after the horse, knowing it was useless. Aching inside, her eyes filled with tears. Hart ran on and on down the dusky road. The mare was a blurred speck of white in the dusk. Finally, when Hart could run no more, she stumbled to a stop. She bent over, grasping for breath. In the distance, the muffled clatter of hooves had faded into silence. The mare was gone. Hart felt sick. How could she have been so careless? She trembled, still dragging in long breaths. Someone else would find the mare, or wolves would. Hart looked back toward Simon's shack. In the deepening dusk, it looked smaller and sadder than ever. Hart stared at it. Simon would be furious. Ruth Oakes would be disappointed in her. But that wasn't what hurt. Now there would be no reason to wake up excited. She would no longer have to get up early to cut grass and hunt extra apples or hurry home. A loneliness as sharp as thorns grew inside Hart. It filled her, and she closed her eyes. She was startled by a sudden cadence of distant hoofbeats. She caught her breath and opened her eyes, staring into the murky dusk. Finally, she saw a blur of white. The mare was galloping back toward her. Astonished, Hart set her feet wide, ready to lunge for the halter. But there was no need. The mare dropped back to a canter, then a trot. She kept coming, her neck arched, breathing hard from the long gallop. Hart felt joy rising inside her. The mare looked grand indeed, trotting closer. She was stout now, her sides filled in, even swollen. Hart narrowed her eyes. There was something heavy in the mare's gait. Not the limp, that was gone. This was something different. The mare stopped, standing so close that Hart simply lifted one hand to take hold of the halter. The dusk around them had deepened. They stood in near darkness, so close, Hart felt the warmth from the mare's run seeping into the chilly air. The mare pushed her muzzle into Hart's chest, blowing out deep breaths. Keeping hold of the halter, Hart slid one hand over the mare's side. The tiniest flutter of movement beneath the white coat made Hart step back, blinking. "You're in foal?" she breathed. The mare shook her mane and started off to the west. The sky was pink and orange now, the clouds colored like fire. Hart pressed her palm against the white flank. The movement didn't return, but the fullness was unmistakable. Hart smiled. The mare was going to have a baby. Simon couldn't sell her now, not to the knacker or anyone else. He wouldn't. All he had to do was wait. 2 horses would be worth much more than 1. Hart put her arms around the mare's neck and began to cry. Ruth Oakes knocked at the door early one morning. "I need to hire Hart," she told Simon. "I can't manage all of my work." "After she feeds the mare." Hart stood up from her winnowing baskets and came to the door. "I cut grass before dawn, like always, Simon." He turned away. Halfway up Crooked Lane, Hart told Ruth the news. Ruth stopped, her hands on her hips. "Have you told Simon?" Hart nodded. "And his reaction?" "He's whistling and humming over it." Hart scuffed her bare feet, making long marks in the dust. They walked onward. "A foal," Ruth said softly. "Lovely. Any birth is like magic." Hart smiled. "Her belly is getting bigger. She's eating as much as I can bring her." "What have you named the mare?" Hart glanced at Ruth. "I haven't. I don't know a name to give her." "You could give her part of yours," Ruth said. Hart liked the idea. Then the mare would be connected to her forever, like family. "Avamere?" "It's a lovely name," Ruth agreed, "and an ancient one. That's why I chose it for you." "Avamere, then," Hart agreed. She wanted to run back and tell the mare, but that was silly, of course. Horses didn't care about names. Someone had left a box of fresh beets at Ruth's door. Most of her patients paid her in trade. She swung the box up and carried it inside. "Let's bundle the dried borage and hyssop. Then we'll walk to the market, if you're willing." Hart smiled. Of course. Walking to town with Ruth meant no one would taunt her. Every family in Ash Grove owed Ruth Oakes. Many of them loved her. No one wanted to offend her. Who could know when they would need the healer to come at midnight? "These?" Hart asked, pointing at the drying racks. Ruth nodded. "And the barrage on the other side. I'll make packets of lobelia and verlaine, and," she looked around the room, "lemongrass, I think." Hart fetched the cloth bags from the bin in the sunny kitchen. She laid them out, then set to work. She was careful not to let too many crisp leaves scatter onto the floor. You do that better than I do now," Ruth said. Hart grinned. She loved being in this house. "We'll use the peachwood baskets," Ruth said. Hart ran to the storage room. The big peachwood baskets were reddish with arched handles. "Perfect," Ruth said, "and a lovely day for the walk." They followed River Road north, then turned on Crosswater Street. The cobblestones were uneven. Hart walked carefully. She didn't want to stub her bare toes. After a few minutes, they crossed the creaking planks of the Tarrant Creek Bridge and went on downhill. "Look," Ruth said, pointing. A mile ahead, coming across the long and narrow Blue River Bridge, carts and wagons turned toward Market Square. Dairytown merchants were arriving. Ruth sighed. "A lot of them this morning. Maybe I should have brought more herbs." "I would like to see Dairytown one day," Hart said aloud. "Maybe even Dunraven's castle." Ruth patted her on the shoulder. "Then you shall." It was not an answer Hart had expected. She laughed aloud. "Good morning, Healer," someone called from across the street. Hart saw Mr. Renner. Mrs. Renner. Her husband ran the tallow works. People moved away from Mrs. Renner as she walked. Tallow stink always clung to her clothes and hair. She had one son, Tibbs Renner, was teased almost as much as Hart. She felt sorry for him, but she was afraid of him too. Ruth crossed the street to say hello to Mrs. Renner. Hart waited, standing aside to let the others go past. "Psst! River fondling!" Hart had been expecting this. Tibbs Renner was the biggest 10-year-old in Ash Grove, and the meanest. Hart tensed as he walked up. "I saw you with that horse," he said. "Where'd you steal it?" Hart's breath caught. She had hoped no one had seen Avamere. "I found her. In the woods," she told him. "Found her?" Tibbs sneered. "No one ever just finds a horse." "I did," Hart said as evenly as she could. "Liar," he said. "Why are you hiding the horse then?" Hart blinked. "I'm not, really. I just thought people might—" "Spread the word about it? Find the real owner?" Tibbs interrupted. Looking past him, Hart saw Ruth saying goodbye to his mother. She was loose in the woods, no bridle or saddle, and she was hurt terribly and— "Liar," Tibbs said. "That's one thing the healer can't cure, lying." "Hart needs no such cure," Ruth said from behind him. Tibbs jumped. "I was joking," he said quickly. Ruth looked at him sternly. "I would hate to think you were insulting my friend." Tibbs mumbled something and walked away, but he glanced back, flushed and scowling. Ruth sighed. Then she led off, turning down Trader's Path when they came to it. Trader's Path was the oldest and the shortest and narrowest street in Ash Grove. It veered toward the river, then ran back along the edge of Market Square. People on foot used it. The wagons went around to Market Street. Hart loved the smells and colors of the Market Square. She wished they could stay all day, but they never did. The booths were setting up. Ruth walked fast, going up and down the aisles, saying hello to nearly everyone they passed. She stopped at a few booths. The herbs sold quickly. Ruth's medicines were known to be pure and strong. Walking home, Hart saw Tibbs coming toward them. He gave a quick nod and hurried past. "That boy makes me worry," Ruth said. Hart's stomach knotted up. It didn't loosen until she ran the length of Crooked Lane and saw the mare standing safe in her fence. Hart hugged her neck, clinging hard. "Avamere," she said when she stepped back, "do you like that name?" The mare shook her mane and rubbed her broad cheek against Hart's shoulder. "Was there a boy out here today?" Hart asked. Avamere shook her mane and stamped a forefoot. Then she went back to picking at scattered blades of grass in the apple crate that served as her hay rick. Join me next time for the second half of Moonsilver from the Unicorn's Secret by Kathleen Duey.